Okay, here we go. I don't know if I'm going to lose a bunch of super chats after this, but this is going to get into the next one. Daniel says, if the police are commanded to stand down to rioters, if citizens are not allowed to defend private property from destruction, how can civilization stand up to the barbarity which seeks to destroy it? We need more Kyles, not less. So we're bringing it in now. This is the big topic. Kyle Rittenhouse killed 2 people, injured another one in what at first was depicted as, we saw what it was depicted as. It was white nationalists crossing state lines armed with an AR-15. And some people refer to it as hunting in the streets. And sure enough, as stuff comes out, you get more video angle, you get more information. It turns out that Kyle apparently did not cross state lines, but we're going to get to this in my questions for you. Turns out he is 17 years old, was not a volunteer. He was a lifeguard that day, volunteering to clean up spray paint, shows up armed to protect a business that had been looted. There's a chase. There's an incident, shots fired. He's being chased down the street, pushed to the ground, hit with a skateboard, shoots 2 people after hearing shots. Apparently one of the people he shot in the arm had pulled a concealed weapon and was going to kill him by his Facebook post. So, and now it, basically turns out that he gets prosecuted for first-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree murder, among other things. And the world is up in arms. I mean, the United States are up in arms now. I didn't mean that with the double entendre, but I don't think I missed out any material facts, but that's where it's at. And, the question, and this is the question, whether or not you think a 17-year-old should be out in the streets with an AR-15 or a rifle protecting businesses is one thing. I said the same thing with the McMichaels. When civilians start patrolling the streets, this type of stuff happens. The question is, why are they out patrolling the streets in the first place? And the question is, what do you think happens when you have a defund the police movement and then you have protests where the police stand down by and large and let the mayhem occur? What do you think happens then? So it's all not even a thought game anymore or thought experiment. It's, what do you think is going to happen if you put this into place? And it's straight out of V for Vendetta. It's just one escalating incident after another to the point where it gets to mayhem. Okay, if I missed any facts, someone correct me. But Robert, first question first. What difference would it have made if he crossed state lines?
None, really.
Okay, good. Second question. Is it legal for a 17-year-old to be in possession of a firearm in the public? I mean, I don't even know how to phrase the question. Is he allowed to own this weapon?
Well, 2 different things there. The Wisconsin law doesn't so much prohibit ownership. The Wisconsin law at issue prohibits having it in public in certain ways. So it's having a dangerous weapon out in public is sort of the goal of the statute. It can be interpreted in multiple ways. There are 2 exceptions, and there's a Second Amendment issue. So the exceptions are that if you're under the age of 18, that generally speaking, you cannot have what the Wisconsin statutes. And people who don't know, I went to law school in Wisconsin, so I'm licensed in Wisconsin. I know a lot about Wisconsin. I practiced there for many years. I still have a practice active there now. And so the law is designed so that Wisconsin's a very pro Second Amendment state in terms of its populace. That's why its self-defense defense is very robust. But for gun possession purposes, if you're under the age of 18, you're not allowed to have a dangerous weapon with certain exceptions. One of those is if it's under certain supervision of target practice, under supervision when you're hunting. But if it's a rifle, then if you're 16 or 17, you are allowed to have it in certain cases. And effectively, it's whether it's federally lawful for you to have it. So apparently, according to the information that's available to us currently, the weapon was somebody else's. It wasn't his. So he didn't own it. He simply physically possessed it that night. And based on the analysis that Will Chamberlain gave, and he's a lawyer and the publisher of the publication Human Events, he believes based on the Wisconsin law is the same as my conclusion, which is that it was legal for him to have it. Unless there's some fact we don't know. So and also in my view is to the extent that the law could be interpreted in such a way as to preclude him from having it, then I believe that the law would violate the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution, particularly in these contexts. because for all the criticism of him for being young and being out on the streets in a difficult situation, our Constitution was written for kids like him to be out defending people when they're under attack. That's what the militia is all about. And back then it was for 12 and 13, 14-year-olds. Very young people fought in the Revolutionary War, including some of my forefathers. When I explained my theories of political and legal strategy, I said, it goes back to my great-granddaddy, Colonel Prescott, who said, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. He's a direct lineal descendant. And so in the context in which he's acting, and I personally, my son, other people that are involved in political activities connected to this, I've told them to stay away from all of these events, that there's too much risk. So that's the paternal advice. But I can't be critical of this kid when that, in fact, historically by our Constitution, they were anticipating kids like him coming to the defense of the community from rioters or looters or any threat. And so in that context, that's the historical context of the Second Amendment. That's the reason why there's a combination of a militia clause and a self-defense clause, effectively, as the Supreme Court has interpreted it. And so, in my view, you're 17 years old, you can be given a gun and go out and kill people overseas in the U.S. Army, but you can't defend your own neighborhood or community or your friends or your family in that community. I don't think so. So to me, if the Wisconsin law was written the way some of the critics believed it was, then I believe it would be a violation of the Second Amendment. So he does face a misdemeanor charge for illegally brandishing, if you will, a dangerous weapon that evening, but I don't believe the law applies to him and the set of facts present here. And doesn't surprise me, the prosecutor in Kenosha is a political prosecutor, you couldn't find somebody dimmer if you had an unlit light bulb. So I mean, there's not a lot going on up there. He brought a bogus prosecution, in my view, against a woman who defended herself against her sex trafficker. So he brings a lot of cases that don't make a lot of sense to me. And this indictment was rushed, and that part of the indictment, I believe, also was just used as an excuse to stick something on there they thought they could get him with. But I believe, unless facts are different than what we know currently, he is not guilty of that crime.
Okay, and actually someone had asked if there was an indictment or just a criminal complaint, but I can't find it anymore. Sorry.
Criminal complaint. It did not go through the grand jury process.
Okay, so actually, I'll bring this super chat up. It's right in front of my face. Whether guilty of having a weapon, he can still use self-defense. This is the question I was about to ask. A felon with a gun at home who uses that gun in self-defense can be guilty of possession of the weapon by certain persons, but innocent by self-defense, had that case and 1 time served. So, okay, that's a very interesting point. So it could be unlawful possession of a firearm, but if he uses it in self-defense, then it would still nonetheless be.
It has zero bearing on the other charges.
Because it's interesting.
So,
the question is,
unlike a felony murder charge, which that wouldn't apply under these. First of all, that crime, even if he was mistaken about his ability to have that gun, then there would be an intent issue still present. Even in that context, it's a misdemeanor. It's not a felony. So they couldn't bring, and they did not bring, a felony murder charge. So they are stuck with the intentional homicide, attempted intentional homicide, and reckless endangerment. 5 different felonies they brought against him. 2 intentional homicide, 1 attempted intentional, maybe 2 actually attempted intentional homicide, and then at least 1 or the other 2 are either 1 reckless endangerment, 1 attempt, or 2 reckless endangerment charges. All of those, Wisconsin has a very, very, very robust self-defense law that only got broader after the Zimmerman case and legislative changes that happened in Wisconsin in 2014. So not only does the Castle Doctrine apply, it is broader than that. Now, of course, for people, the Castle Doctrine stems from our Revolutionary era, where where the British were coming to go into a guy's house, and he said, "This is my house, this is my castle over my dead body." I think they did end up killing the guy, but that's where thank God, the Brits. But that's what led in part to the idea of the Castle Doctrine built into American legal arcana, if you will. But it only applies if you're in front of your own home or things of this nature. The Castle Doctrine wouldn't be particularly applicable here. Just the regular self-defense would be.
Okay, because people were saying Castle Doctrine is defending your home and property. The question then is, could he be argued to be defending his property in the context? So Castle Doctrine,
he doesn't need it. He doesn't need it because Wisconsin has the same self-defense law, whether it's at your house or someone else. The Castle Doctrines, the things that benefit you in the Castle Doctrine, which is the right, you don't have to retreat, you don't have to use the least possible force, just reasonable force, so on and so forth. That applies to self-defense across the board in Wisconsin. Wisconsin has one of the broadest. Like I know Nate and some other people were making, so there's been some commentary about whether or not the sort of a provocation or whether this was like armed robbery and arrest, etc. They don't understand just how broad self-defense law is in Wisconsin.
Well, okay, so that was the question where I was going with, assuming he did not have the right to own or possess the firearm. So if it's a felony or misdemeanor firearm charge, whatever, if you're in unlawful possession of a firearm and somebody else, now we get into this chicken and the egg sort of thing, somebody else says that guy's got a gun and it's illegal, I feel threatened and therefore I'm acting in self-defense by pulling a gun on him. Now he's acting in self-defense to defend against the guy pulling the gun on him. Where does that chicken and the egg sort of stop or start? Because
that's what's extraordinary. The scope of self-defense is very expansive in Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin, you can even provoke the entire incident and have self-defense available to you in most contexts. So the self-defense is you have to prove. And here's the first part. There was a misunderstanding out there. Some people thought self-defense is an affirmative defense, so that meant he had to prove it. That's not true. In Wisconsin, they have to prove the lack of self-defense by beyond a reasonable doubt, or he walks. So they have to prove that, first of all, and not only that, the standard is a hybrid of subjective and objective. So it's whether or not a reasonable person, as judged by his life experience and someone in his shoes. So not whether you or I would ever be there, not whether you or I would try to take these actions. It's whether or not, if we were him, would we have seen, one, a real risk of serious bodily harm? And number two, would the amount of force we used be reasonable in light of the risk we perceive it? So it's a reasonable person standard. That's the objective part, but as seen through the eyes of Rittenhouse. And that's the subjective part. So the government has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that every time he fired his weapon, he did not have a reasonable belief either that use of force was a reasonable use of force given what he faced, or that he did not face great bodily harm. If you face great bodily harm, you can use anything in your self-defense as long as it's reasonable, and there's no duty to retreat. There's no duty to use the least possible force. None of that, not in Wisconsin. And so now there is a provocation exception, but that provocation exception is also even limited in Wisconsin. So to give you a contrast, in the Ahmaud Arbery case in Georgia has a broader provocation exception. So years ago in the 1920s, people were out on a posse searching for somebody. The posse broke up. They later saw the person they thought was the target of the posse, and before they could even pull their gun, that person shot them. They said that because they created the whole circumstance in which that person felt threatened for an illegal arrest, as it turned out, that they should have known was an illegal arrest, that he had self-defense and they did not, for shooting back, because they ended up shooting back. And that's not the case in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, you can even create the whole. What has to happen is provocation is only an exception to self-defense. If Rittenhouse went up there with the intention of causing great bodily harm or inducing someone else to try to cause him great bodily harm so that he could cause them great bodily harm. So unless you're going up there to kill people, or then basically doesn't matter what happened, that whole thing. Like, let's say you got into the fight and you started it. Let's say you instigated it here. You said something to somebody there. Doesn't matter. That you have complete self-defense. In Wisconsin, anytime you fear great bodily harm, you have the right to use great bodily harm to prevent or terminate that threat, unless it was the equivalent of criminal entrapment. So like, okay, I'm going to go in here, like some movies and whatnot might have these kind of things. I'm going to create a situation where I'm going to get him to pull a gun on me so that I can shoot him. Outside of that particular circumstance, provocation is not an exception to self-defense in Wisconsin. This is why the charges against him Well, we can get into the facts next, but that's the legal scope. Very broad self-defense. Doesn't matter if you provoked it unless you provoked that precise kind of criminal violence, deep violence to occur, and the rest.
And I'm picturing that type of criminal provocation would be taxi driver-esque provocation, like strapping it up to your wrist so it pops out quickly and going to pick a fight knowing that you're going to do that.
For folks who may not know, we are not insulting all taxi drivers. That is in reference to the great film by Martin Scorsese.
Great, violent, classic. Although I look at even the classic Hollywood movies now with a bit of a stink eye, just knowing what goes on in that place now. Okay, so that's a good overview of the law. I mean, it answers the state line, crossing the state line, irrelevant. Whether or not he was in illegal possession of the firearm, irrelevant for the purposes of the incident that ensued afterwards. Provocation, even assuming he provoked it, which by all accounts he didn't, broad application of, or let's just say there's...
and even if he knew they were trying to say execute a citizen's arrest, doesn't matter. He can fully defend himself. The self-defense provisions only don't apply to a public law enforcement officer. So a public law enforcement officer, you're not allowed to use self-defense against in a wide range of circumstances. But citizens trying to execute a citizen's arrest, that is not that does not remove your right of self-defense.
Okay, now, so I guess we get into someone had asked about extradition of Rittenhouse. Where did he get extradited to and from? I thought he was in Wisconsin.
No, so he lives in Illinois. And for people to know, by the way, there was this impression that this was some far off Illinois place that he must have been connected to some secret militia to travel there. I know that part of Wisconsin well. I said, I practiced in Wisconsin for many years. The Kenosha sits between Milwaukee and Chicago. It's an old industrial city, very blue collar city, a little bit down on its luck economically the last 20 years. The kind of place where key swing voters gave Trump the election in 2016. But there's a lot of people who work on that part of the Illinois border whose cultural, they go back and forth. So I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We are right on the border of Georgia, partially on the border of Alabama. And it was really all part of the same community for many people there. The same is true in that part of Illinois. So that part of northwestern Illinois, a lot of people go up and back and forth to Wisconsin, and they're really part of an overlapping community. So like people are saying, oh, he wasn't defending his community. No, that's incorrect. He was defending his community. That is an overlap with his community. So it was his community. The fact that his community happened to be across a single state line didn't change the fact that they're all part of the same community. This is like people live in the Jersey suburbs, but really are part of the Philadelphia community, and things like that. So it's the same sort of dynamic. Kansas City, for example, St. Louis. I mean, you have cities that have a community. Little Rock, Arkansas. You have West Little Rock. You have places that have not Little Rock. I'm sorry, Memphis. West Memphis is in Arkansas, but Memphis itself is in Tennessee. So you have communities that are overlap culturally, and that I know that part of the country very well. That he was part of his community. Kenosha is part of his community. Just because it happens not to be the state he lives in doesn't change the fact that for cultural, social, economic purposes, he's part of that. They're all part of that same community, loosely speaking. And it appears he was working up there as a lifeguard and whatnot. So which would not be a surprise at all. That's kind of the norm. A lot of the kids go up to Kenosha. Kenosha, I think, is actually one of the bigger metropolitan areas for someone who lived where he lived within closer proximity than Chicago or things like that.
Okay, so interesting. What was I about to say? Oh, so let's get to some of the facts that were misrepresented. A lot of people saying, throwing around the white nationalism. By all accounts, his social media has been scoured by now, and there have been no inflammatory or compromising posts on social media. The issue about him wearing the rubber gloves, people were saying he deliberately did it to avoid fingerprinting the gun. Apparently, I mean, these are just the facts that I've read about coming out in the last little while. Apparently, he's wearing the rubber gloves because he was administering first aid and helping out. He was administering first aid to people and didn't want to touch them, from what I understand. Is that your understanding as well, Robert?
Yeah, so he was doing three things up there. He was trying to fix graffiti earlier in the day. There was a businessman whose mechanic shops were under attack. And so he asked people in the community to come out and defend him because it was clear the police were not going to do so given what happened the night before. And so that's how friends of his asked him to participate. This wasn't him driving up from Illinois. It was him being asked to participate. That's why apparently one of his friends is the one who gave him the gun. He had the gun in over his body with a I'm blanking right now on the word for some weird reason. What do you? It was strapped on. Yep. And that's why they weren't able to grab it, by the way. It appears he's well trained. He wants to be a policeman by various social media and other posts that have been out there in the past. So he sees himself as a defender of the local community. He wants to pursue that career. And given everything that happened, he appears to have trained himself well, because usually that would have gone a much worse direction given the circumstances. I mean, I get people saying, hey, people died, etc. Usually when someone's under that kind of attack, multiple people shooting guns in the air behind him, people throwing things at him. It was not just a plastic bag. Plastic bags don't go whoom. Something was in that plastic bag, like a brick or something heavy meant to hurt him. But that's his sort of backstory, is that he was asked to defend these two different mechanic shops nearby. That was where they had burned the cars the night before. And for people who don't know Kenosha, by the way, that's a very residential mixed area. So a lot of their commercial areas mixed residential, mixed commercial. So, I mean, I was shocked by witnessing what I was witnessing. I mean, not only is Kenosha not the kind of place that ever has riots, Kenosha is where they were rioting was not like the downtown of Portland, where they're mostly targeting buildings and occasionally going to the neighborhoods. This is in a neighborhood. And so that's why these small business people were worried. The other problem, as has subsequently come out from a local Indian immigrant who had set up a business there, insurance generally will not cover riots. So if a riot happens, they call that domestic terrorism, the equivalent of an act of God. So it doesn't matter what insurance you have. Any damage done to your property, you're out every penny, nickel, dime, and dollar. And good luck suing the people who did it. It's hard for you to even know who they are. And if you could, they likely don't have a lot of resources to ever pay you back for what happened. And that's why.
And from what I understand, I mean, I don't know any of this. I understood Kenosha was, I don't want to know if rural is the right word, but small townish type thing. It's
yeah.
People are not the rioters are not from the neighborhood.
Correct. Yeah, a lot of the rioters were not, because it'd be unusual for that to occur. Like I said, Kenosha is mostly a blue collar town, old industrial town, small size city, really. In between, it's not far from Racine. In between Milwaukee and Chicago. And so it's sort of an extended community. Paul Ryan represented part of that district congressionally for a long time. So that gives you some sense of it, though that part is a little more democratic than where Kenosha is. But it was very blue-collar ethnic back in the day, some African-American population, but it's not like North Milwaukee. And so it's not a huge African-American population. And it doesn't have a history of riots or this kind of dispute. I think this probably surprised people in Kenosha what happened. Now, the occasionally the sheriff there has gotten into trouble for some using some Wisconsinite verbiage now and then about some things. So that's part of the political backdrop of him likely trying to be careful at how he handled things. And of course, it was another BLM narrative about banks, which we can get into later. But BLM loves divisive narratives. And so they like fake narratives. They like stories that are false. If you go back and study riots or things like this over time, like say the Detroit race riots of 1943, you'll find the way they really spread was people spread lies on both sides. African-American community spread a lie about what the white people were doing, and white people spread lies about what the African-American community was doing. It includes stuff like they threw a mother and a child off the bridge. Oh, they're randomly assaulting women. Things that were not true, but it spread like wildfire to let the riots get crazy. BLM is a master of this. They prefer cases that, when you dig in, are not the clean narrative that they present. They're often fake news narratives promoting people with a rap sheet as long as your arm. And that's why when I have a lot of very good civil rights cases, I've done many of them right there in Wisconsin, that area of Wisconsin. BLM is nowhere to be found. Because they don't want uniting cases that lead to legitimate reform. They want divisive cases that lead to complete destruction. And in case people think I'm just being anti-BLM, this is their own words. You can research them. That their belief is, this is why they talk about systemic and institutional and structural. They believe that the only way to reform the system, they want to destroy the system, because they believe you must destroy it in order to get to utopia. And so that's the net effect of their objective. And they believe that divisiveness leads to destruction, not uniting cases. So they light a flame, the fire of often false rumors and fake news narratives, like they did against Rittenhouse, like they did on behalf of Jacob Banks, who, when I looked at that arrest and the shooting, while I always find it unfortunate, it did not strike me as a case of a wrongful exercise of force, because you had someone who had outstanding domestic violence warrants, sexual assault warrants, stolen a car. I mean, especially like there's your classic BLM narrative. Now, I'll use Blake now. I'd used Michael Brown and Ferguson before. I'd used Trayvon Martin before. But the better example is Jacob Banks. And three things combined to create the fake news narrative that lit Kenosha on fire, that put Rittenhouse where he was in this very difficult position of running for his life. And many miracle he's not dead, because as one of the people who got shot in the arm said, his intention was to unload his whole magazine into Rittenhouse's head. And so is that first you have BLM, believes in destruction, needs divisive narratives to get there, and so they promote fake news narratives that will inflame both sides, where one side believes the crazy rumor, the other side knows the crazy rumor is not true, but again, that promotes divisiveness. That's the goal. That's the objective. Part two, you have a Democratic Party and a news media who believe these kind of BLM narratives hurt Trump and favor them, so they help put out the flames or spread the flames. And then third, you have the GoFundMe phenomenon, which has been developing since Ferguson. I mean, and parts of Michael Brown's family ended up arguing over who got what proceeds related to Michael Brown. It's not a pretty sight, frankly. But what happens is, if let's say you're a family member and something happens, and if the people know the true story, you're not going to be able to raise much money. You promote the BLM narrative, so you set up a GoFundMe account for you to get a bunch of cash. You don't need to win a civil suit anymore. You can get millions of dollars, as Jacob Blake GoFundMe has raised over $2 million. Now, who's that going to go to? Is it going to go to the kids that he wasn't really properly taken care of? Or is it going to go to his parents? Is it going to go to someone else? Is it going to go to the ex-girlfriend he had assaulted? We'll see. I can guarantee you this: there's going to be no federal prosecutor looking at that GoFundMe the way they looked at Build the Wall. But so, it shows you the political motivation by the discrepancy of treatment of comparable institutions or events. So when you combine those events, it leads to a false narrative being promoted. If you look at the whole story of Blake, Blake had an outstanding criminal warrant for issues related to domestic violence. He returned to that. Well, let me go back. The BLM narrative that came out, and I have my brother-in-law who is concerned about this because he's on the BLM side of the equation. I have family members and friends who are on the BLM side of the equation. And they're surprised often by my resistance to this because they've known my civil rights work for 20 plus years. And I'm like, these cases are killing civil rights in America, and they're undermining us, not helping us. But your BLM narrative was Jacob Blake was just driving down the street with his family in his nice car and little minivan, and then he sees a couple of people are arguing in the front lawn, and he gets out to try to bring peace to the people in the front lawn, and all of a sudden the police show up, chase him, and shoot him 7 times in the back in his own car in front of his kids. That's almost all fake. I mean, as soon as the story came out, I was like, that's going to be fake. That's highly unlikely in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And so instead, the actual story is he had repeatedly assaulted his ex-girlfriend, the mother of his 3 children, on a repeated basis over the years. She finally got upset with it when he came in, assaulted her right in the presence of his son and her son, and sexually assaulted her. Then took her keys and went off. And that wasn't his vehicle. He had a restraining order placed on him, as is typical of those criminal cases. Usually, some states they're called orders of protection. Some cases they're restraining orders or witness orders. He came back to that very house, even though he knew he had a restraining order related to he not being there because of the past crimes he had committed against her. She panics. She immediately calls the police. That's when they show up. He doesn't have custody over those kids. That isn't his vehicle. They attempt to get him to calm down and comply. Instead, he puts one of the officers in a headlock before they get loose. At which point they tase him. He's unfazed somehow by a taser. And here's good contact. And he has a knife, and he has the kind of knife in his hand apparently all along, where you have the 4. It's where you put it around your fingers. So it's like, what do you call those things when you use them as a punching thing?
Brass knuckles. That's
it. So it's got those brass knuckle kind of things connected to the knife. So that means it's a very hard knife to separate from somebody. So that explains why they're not grabbing him, trying to hold him down. They also see they're being filmed. And in the post-George Floyd era, you're going to have a lot of cops nervous about making physical contact with a defendant when they're being filmed with people screaming at them in the neighborhood. So between the two, they pull their guns. Both officers are pointing their gun right at him, asking him to stop and to drop the knife. He just walks up like he doesn't care, walks right around the car, and then starts to get into the car, where apparently the 3 kids are sitting in the back, not his car. He has a history of domestic abuse. And here, for a police officer, 2 key facts are important. For a police officer, 1/4 of them are shot or killed on a domestic abuse call. Another 4th of them are shot or killed dealing with a car stop of some kind. So now you have a car stop, domestic abuse combined. You have a 50%. That's where half of police getting shot or killed. Not only that, with that knife and those kids sitting in the back, and you got a history of domestic abuse, and you got a guy acting irrational, that's the combination that leads to somebody trying to kill kids, somebody trying to drive off and do some sort of murder-suicide. If you're a cop, you can't rule that out in that juncture. And I think that's why the police officer who didn't shoot that whole time, when he's in the car, can't get him out of the car. He can't, like, people are like, well, why doesn't he just back off? Because then he could either take off with the car and do God knows what, or he could turn around and harm those kids. It was at that point that he realized, in his view, the only way to end this from getting any worse for either the police officers, the girlfriend that's there, or for the kids in the back seat is to use force, deadly force. In that context, it is highly likely, this is why he hasn't been arrested. I don't believe the Kenosha prosecutor will control this. It will likely be controlled by the state Wisconsin Department of Justice. I know from the jury pools in that community, there's pretty much no chance that cop gets convicted of a crime or of a civil rights violation. I know Ben Crump is in town, and he tends to show up in some of these cases politically that I think undermine civil rights across the country, but that's my own thing. I think he's trying to do what he sees as right, but I don't think it's helping. So in that context, the narrative gets lit that, the NBA propagates it, LeBron James propagates it.
I saw Andrew Yang tweeting about it, and I still can't reconcile the version you're telling me with the version that's being depicted on social media. I have no vested interest. I have no bias, for lack of a better word. I cannot reconcile what facts are from one side versus the way it's being depicted by the other. Like, it makes no sense to me.
Exactly. And they just lied from the get-go. I was sent the video early on, and I put it out on Twitter. It's like, this is going to blow up in the wrong direction again, knowing that BLM is looking for divisive narratives, and this hit all the T. This was perfect storm, perfect timing. So you have a case that when you dig in doesn't support it, which means you'll have people opposed to your position. That creates the division. And it was a uniting case. That's a clean case. I got cases where mothers, 8.5-month-old pregnant, were locked up in isolation in Milwaukee County, ignored overnight, and woke up with a dead baby in their arms. So it's not like I'm bashful about criticizing Wisconsin. State police, city police, county police, all of them. I've sued them. I've sued more cops in Wisconsin than any state in the country. So I'm not bashful about that at all. If I think something is wrong, I'm going to say so and do something about it. And if I thought it was a bad shoot at any level, by golly, I'd be saying so from the high mountains. But I knew as soon as BLM was pushing it, I was like, I bet it's bogus. And then I started hearing the narrative. I was like, that's unlikely to be true. I saw the video early on. I was like, I don't even understand what he's doing. He's got 2 cops pointing at him. He's totally ignoring him and hopping in the car. They can't afford for him to take off in the car. They can't afford to him hurt anyone if anyone else is in that car. They have to take action at some point, and everything else had failed. So once I saw that, I was like, and then there's the GoFundMe, raise $2 million for who knows who. Ben Crump shows up. That doesn't usually turn out to be a good sign for a case. And then the Democrats and media jumped on it very quickly. And if LeBron James is pushing it, it's probably a bad case. That one big phony. I got my issues there. That I have not backed away from. These people are hurting cases. It was a year ago in Wisconsin. I was about to lose a case that was a exceptional case that just a year before, mock juries in Wisconsin all agreed, 90% of them agreed that my client should win and a substantial verdict should be awarded. And just a year ago, the whole jury pool I realized was bad. Luckily, I figured it out before the government did. They ended up writing a very, very big check in that case. And so we got a good settlement. And that was important because people are like, oh, well, you're a lawyer, you can make money, whatever. Why are you whining about this? It's not about me. It's about a grandmother and a son who deserve some remedy so they could have a future in life for the horrific thing that happened to their father, and the city having to write a big check. It was the biggest check they'd ever written, I think ever written in Wisconsin's history, actually, for that kind of case. Why? Because that's what they pay attention to. Politicians start writing big checks. They start figuring out that what I and other lawyers that were on that case with me have been saying for a half decade, which is it's time to clean up the Milwaukee County Jail. It's time to clean up rogue cops. It's time to clean up bad prosecutors. And they pay attention when they have to write a big check. They're like, golly gee, maybe they're right. And that's why it's important. That's why it matters. And so, but no, this case was a bogus case meant to get, and this plays into Antifa. Two things that are important about a lot of these riots and looting, aside from that backdrop of BLM. One is communists need fascists and fascists need communists. This is what they learned from the 1920 street theater of the violence in Spain, Italy, and Germany during that time period, which was fascists were able to rise because of the threat of communists. Communists were often able to rise with the threat of fascists. So they need each other. And Antifa has been begging to create a conflict. That's why they love the Proud Boys. They wanted to create conflict with the Proud Boys. They like the Patriot Prayer folks that they shot and killed one just yesterday in Portland because they want conflict. They want confrontation. And this is always my counter, even in Kyle's case with other people, is to say, look, I understand why you want to defend yourself, and it's actually fits very well within our constitutional American history for Kyle Rittenhouse to do what he did. He did what the founders anticipated people like him would do. But the flip side is the left wants to provoke violence, and it's very hard to control that situation or setting when the National Guard's not present and the police are not doing their job and they're scared and terrified to do it. And you put yourself at great risk and exposure. And I think people need to know that fully. I don't encourage or incentivize people to take those actions, but I'm not going to condemn a kid for doing something that our founders said were necessary when somebody really needed protection. The way I put it is this: I myself wouldn't do it. But on the flip side, I think if my house and my business was under attack and I knew somebody could come to my defense and it was my only available defense, would I really tell them not to? I can't honestly say I wouldn't. So that's where I can't be critical of Kyle's decision. And like I said, from a constitutional perspective, he's fitting right within the constitutional perspective of how our government was intended this to happen in terms of him protecting himself and protecting other people. You're protecting his own community. It was the democratization of the use of force. It's what the militia's purpose was to not have a national army, honestly. But so given that backdrop, you throw in Antifa. Antifa is called anti-fascist. It's based on a German group formed by the communists in the 1920s in Germany. It restarted in the mid-1970s in West Germany. They formed it. They called themselves, they created what they called black blocs because of how they dressed and how they organized to make it very difficult to be spotted when they committed criminal acts. They would usually get together on May Day, which is a sign of their communist orientation. That's why they did it on May Day, creating violent confrontations with police. It spread to the United States out of the Occupy movement in 2014. It had always been here, but it had been not very big. The Occupy movement was infiltrated by a lot of these Antifa types. And what that effectively did is it created a circumstance or situation. You're back, Sir Viva.
I swiped out of the damn thing again. Now I lost all the super chats that I was taking pictures of. Sorry.
Say la vie. Well, yeah, people can put it in the comments and we can track and trace them and try to answer.
I got a bunch of pictures. Now, I don't know where I interrupted you, but I wanted to bring up... Okay, I'm bringing this right up here because I wanted to bring up Nate Brody's... where is it? I just wanted to bring up Nate Brody's face. Here we go. So this is Nate the lawyer, and it was on the subject we were talking about before, which was, when a police officer is entitled to use a lethal force. And Nate just did a great video on it, on the Blake case, and addressing the two criteria established by jurisprudence as to the threat and the level of force that can be used. And it's an eye-opening video, not even knowing any of these additional facts, Robert, that you just elucidated.
Yeah, and for those people that don't know, Nate's a good place to subscribe. He comes at a different political perspective than I do on issues, but he has a great police background, which is good, I think. It's good to get both sides. And secondly, he comes from a police background and a lawyer background, so he can combine the two in ways that, particularly in these kind of cases, give you a very informed understanding of the situation. And we disagree now and then, but it's always his opinion is always a well-educated and well-informed one. And if he's lucky, maybe he too will get cited by the SDNY someday. So he's right there in New York. I believe.
He's in New York.
So
I should also mention uncivil law covers a lot of the subjects as well from a different perspective. If anybody, uncivil law is the moderator. If I can see I'll bring his avatar up, but also covers these issues, a different perspective as well, equally as informative. Two things I want to add before I forget. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
First of all, who is representing Kyle at this point in time? Do we know?
We do not know. So there was a public defender that appeared for him at the extradition proceeding in Illinois. The reason, going back to that question, is because he's in Illinois. I don't understand why they went through the extradition process. Frankly, they could have just asked him to appear at a future Wisconsin court proceeding, and that worked. I don't think he would have resisted that. But I think they just wanted the shock and awe of the extradition proceeding. That people live in other states or accused of a crime of another state. Usually, you just come back. They don't extradite you between states. But he's subject to an extradition proceeding in Illinois at this juncture. He was represented by a public defender at that proceeding. There are lawyers who have said they're representing him or plan on representing him. There are people who have been asking whether apparently some of those lawyers have referenced a team. I'm not part of the team, and I have no idea who is. So I do know of one LA lawyer that's been mentioned in the case. Yes, I won't go into detail about that. Because
I forget now where I read it. I read a statement that Kyle had put out, or his attorneys had put out. It was a 3-page statement describing the events.
And they're claiming to represent him, but I haven't heard that from him himself. Now, I'm not saying they're not representing him. I'm just saying that we don't have direct confirmation from Kyle. And some people have asked about fundraising related to Kyle's campaign.
Yes, that's
my general view is the best way to raise money for a case like this is for someone like Ezra to create a GoFundMe if the family doesn't want to create one for some reason. Ideally, the family creates one, but or someone like Ezra to do it, where the goal is you raise the money and it goes directly to the family. And it's clear up front that the purpose is legal defense fund, but any excess funds will go for the family's benefit, going through this difficult time, economic impact, etc. There are ethical issues, financial issues, legal issues, tax issues with trying to have a separate 501c3 or 4 raise the funds. So I know there's a whole bunch of people talking about that in different contexts. I'm not commenting on anyone else that's doing that or maybe trying to do that. I'm just explaining why I do not recommend that strategy. One, you cannot get a 501c entity these days approved in less than a year by the IRS. So you have an entity that may never get approved. Secondly, the reason why I've been on this pitch for years now, back to when Build the Wall people were active and other people, I said, look, this is high risk. So if you're going to be in the fundraising business for causes that people don't like, then every single statement you make can be subject to some scrutiny. That all of it, definitely in the IRS context, 501c3, 501c4, they can require your donors be disclosed. The donors that information can, if people study the Tea Party case, that was all about donor disclosure to 501c3s and 501c4s. So when the IRS was doing illicit investigation of Tea Party targets, that's what that was all about. So I've been telling people for years now, and I do a lot of IRS work and a lot of tax work, civilly and criminally. And the IRS has been very bad about this for years now. I mean, they were trying to even misuse the authority to seize medical records under the Obamacare and enforcement provisions to be able to spy on people's private medical information. I brought the biggest Bivens class action, civil rights action in history to stop it. But so this is a problem that I would not trust IRS entities. The only reason to have a 501c3 or 4, the difference is, one can do politics, the other one can't. But if one does politics, then that is subject to taxation. It's not given the same treatment. There's a bunch of self-dealing provisions that can be a nightmare to deal with, given how they're interpreted and construed. You can see now from the Bannon indictment and the Build the Wall indictment that any statement you make that they decide to call false, even if your own donors don't complain, you might be facing 8 to 10 years in federal prison and a bankrupting criminal case. So my advice is don't create a 501c3 or 4. It's tough if I'm a lawyer and I receive money from a third party, it can be an administrative quagmire for being able to handle the case in terms of a straight up legal defense fund. That's why the best legal defense funds, just a GoFundMe account, controlled at some level by the family, directly or indirectly. All the proceeds go to the family. The family decides where they want to spend the money and the rest. And now I do support independent political organizations that are trying to be like ACLU, Southern Poverty Law Center, but for what those organizations were originally set up for, but they're no longer honoring, which is civil liberties in America and against discrimination in America. I started Free America Law Center, or helped found it, helped promote it. Other people run it in order to be able to create that. But I deliberately made it so that it's volunteer, member-driven, subscriber-driven, very small amounts, because the trap of these other entities is that you end up with some big donor and you're dependent on that one donor. And so the goal was to try to create something that was sustainable in the ACLU model without being dependent on a big donor, without getting into the problems of having a legal defense fund inside of that. So that's my general view for people that have asked about that. I would wait till you get a signal from the family directly as to where that fund should go, or if it's someone that has a long track record of doing so honorably, someone like Ezra Levant.
So yes, Elliot Moran asked why Ezra Levant. Ezra Levant does it for every, well, not for every, but for a lot of the cases that he covers. He just did it for Millie Weaver, and distinct fundraising or distinct account, distinct finances, no intermingling, and it goes straight, and they do whatever they want with it.
And there's no concerns, no complaints. I had people inquiring, being concerned because one of the lawyers out of LA being mentioned has a lot of lawsuits pending against him connected to I wouldn't recommend that. I think that's ill-advised. I would not be creating a 501c3 or 501c4 if I had a bunch of lawsuits against me for people saying I owed them money, allegations of misappropriation of funds, litigation funders suing. That's not a good idea. And even if they have the best intentions, even if every allegation against them is totally bogus, look at Build the Wall. You're opening up. Rittenhouse case is going to get massive scrutiny. Be careful with what you do if you go down that path. So but sometimes people listen to me, sometimes they don't. But I hope it goes a little bit different direction in that respect. I have zero doubts that the kid is innocent. I think he's a 17-year-old kid who tried to do the best he can and was actually acting in the most consistent manner with our constitutional traditions. Going back, that's right, Antifa. So to understand some of the context here, my view of a lot of criminal violence by rioters and other groups like that over time comes from my study of the Ku Klux Klan when I was a Southern history student in college. When I studied the Klan, I was curious, was racism what led to people to being active in the Klan and committing violence, or was something else? And what I found was fascinating is racism was the excuse, not the reason. And you dig into their history, almost all the people that were violent on behalf of the Klan were sociopaths. And so then I became curious. I was like, well, sociopathology within a society stays pretty stable in terms of percentage of population. Why does Klan violence go up and go down and go up and go down over time between 1870 and 1960? And actually 1860 to 1970 is what the time period I was looking at. And what I found was the key was a political permission slip. If you give a sociopath the political permission slip to act on their sociopathological fantasies and instincts, and then that's when all of a sudden politicized violence rises. So I've used the same model to study the rise of ISIS, the rise of Islamic terrorists. You dig in, it's not really the Islamic text that's causing people to go out and commit these terroristic acts. It's people politicizing that Islamic text for radicalized purposes who are in positions of political prominence, such as imams and whatnot, giving a political permission slip for the sociopaths within their community to go out and act on it. And that's why it's like a lot of the people that committed the horrible terrorism act in France, study their background. You'll find they met in jail. Not a coincidence. They were criminals long before they became terrorists. So the same is true of Antifa. So Antifa recruits sociopathic personalities. So that's why you find it striking. Like as soon as the Rittenhouse case happened, I was like, I bet the 3 people shot the 2 people that died, I bet they'll have a criminal track record and some, really creepy behavioral history. Well, yep, check. And it's because it's the sociopaths that are out there. Who is going to Kenosha with guns even and chasing down people, burning people's cars, burning people's businesses, threatening to burn people's homes, assaulting random people? They're not doing that for civil rights. They're not doing that in the honor. They're hurting civil rights by what they're doing. It's sociopaths who've been given a political permission slip by the Antifa methodology. And the key has been Democratic politicians giving that political permission slip more broader. Like if you want to trace the history of Klan violence, don't follow the Klan, follow the history of the White Citizens Commission or White Citizens Council and similar kind of groups. Because it was when powerful people said, hey, go out there and do it, that all of a sudden the violence surged. As soon as they said, no, okay, we're no more political permission slip, violence would drop off the rock. So that's the cue to it. Even though it's sociopaths committing the violence, that explains why they're committing the violence. The reason why the violence occurs at the rate it does is the political permission slip from political actors. And the Democrats sending that message loud and clear now for months. Really, it started back during 2016 when they greenlit violence against the Trump campaign, beginning in Chicago in March of 2016, continued to San Diego and California. Harmeet Dillon brought a great case going to that earlier claim, when can you sue when the police are basically doing stand downs? Well, that she's trying to establish those legal rights. I think her group, I think is called Center for Liberty. She's created a good 501c entity that she went through all the process to get approved to provide general ACLU type support that's not legal to fund defense fund specific. She's doing great work in this context. She's trying to establish the constitutional rights in the San Jose case so that when they do a stand down or when they send people to get beat up, the city can be held liable. There are ways to do it. It's just very tough and tricky. But the political permission slip told the sociopaths who attacked Kyle Rittenhouse, and they had criminal history, child abuse history in one case, domestic abuse in another case, assault in another case. One of them had a gun and admitted later he planned on emptying his magazine into Kyle, but for Kyle shooting him in the arm. And so there's no doubt when you look at the facts, they were chasing him. They were firing guns in the air to make it sound like someone was shooting right at him. They were screaming, get him. They were screaming, beat him. They were screaming other things. Some apparently tapes of kill him was on there. And the two people who died, both of them grabbed his gun and were trying to get his gun away from him. By the way, when you grab somebody else's gun, you're no longer unarmed. So when the media is saying, oh, the person's unarmed, if you grab somebody's gun, that's considered under the law, usually you being armed, because you have as much ability for something bad to happen with that dangerous weapon as the person you're trying to take it from. So the net effect of it is that he killed and shot criminals. That's who he did. People that really are dregs on society. But would I prefer none of that to happen? Absolutely. But it happened because of what BLM put in motion, what the Democrats put in motion, what the media put in motion, what the politicians put in motion. I have no respect for the Democratic governor of Wisconsin. Right now, I'm helping a couple of lawyers with a case where for years the state of Wisconsin put sex abusers in charge of children who are in state custody. And they raped and assaulted these kids for years. Finally sought justice for them. The state of Wisconsin refuses to pay a single penny to those people that were hurt. And it's this governor refusing to do so. And he's going to grandstand about how he cares about what's happening in Kenosha. Guy's a fraud. So the fact they wouldn't even offer a penny to that kid's family is just outrageous in the case that I have. So that I come at this from a knowledgeable perspective at what's happening in Wisconsin. Some of our political actors are the prosecutor in Kenosha is bad. The governor is bad. There are people that have politicized the prosecutorial process in ways that are deeply problematic. The people of Wisconsin are good people, and a good jury is likely to acquit Rittenhouse across the board. If they had any IQ, they would drop these charges quickly. They should look at recall efforts against the prosecutor this is his second bogus prosecution. It's
someone had asked previously, actually, do you think Kyle is overcharged in the case?
He shouldn't be charged at all, period.
Okay.
So it's absurd that he's facing any criminal prosecution of any kind. 17-year-old kid, working class background. And the mistake they made is they thought their fake narrative would work. People would demonize him. No one would come to his defense, pretend that this was another Charlottesville when it had nothing to do with Charlottesville, when he's going to have a broad defense. I mean, whoever ends up defending him, however, there's going to be people helping out. I mean, I don't know if I'll ever be part of the case, but I'm going to help him out no matter what and what I can do in the court of public opinion. I know lots of other good lawyers. There's a guy called, I think it's Shipwrecked Crew is what he goes by on Twitter. Excellent lawyer. He's volunteered his time. There's been Kurt Schlichter, another excellent lawyer. So there's great, excellent lawyers. Lynn Wood has offered to help in whatever way he could. There's plenty of excellent lawyers out there that have said they're going to do something to help in any way they can. Rittenhouse will have a competent and capable defense at some juncture by some point, however that's done. And they've made a mistake by bringing it. And if they're smart, and I've dealt with a lot of people in Wisconsin, usually if you bring the right political ammo up front, they drop bad cases. And that's what they should do here. And just later say, hey, we were just trying to keep everybody calm and not have any more people show up with guns. And yes, we now realize based on the full factual record, But they did a lot of misleading statements in the criminal complaint, which is why you have higher risk than normal.
Do you so he has a criminal complaint. Does he need to get indicted? Because someone's saying any chance that a grand jury refuses to indict. But if there's already a criminal complaint filed, do they still need a grand jury indictment?
No, they can go forward without the grand jury indictment in all likelihood. I'd have to double check that in certain components, whether some of the charges would require that. But the nature of it is that I think they would ultimately drop the charges if they realize that big people they respect were coming in for the defense. They would back down. And there's plenty of good lawyers I know in Wisconsin who will be happy to get involved.
And the collective knowledge of the internet, because you see within 48 hours of internet knowledge coming together, 4chan alleges to have identified the shooter in yesterday's murder.
Well, when the New York Times does a breakdown of their digital analysis division of the Rittenhouse case, and they show just how much it was self-defense, you don't have a case anymore if you're the prosecutor in Kenosha. So because that's the New York Times. So that's a publication that's usually on your side in this kind of case. And the media people that are still pushing the fake narrative about this kid, they're full of it. Now, people have asked about libel suits. It's hard to bring libel suits once a criminal charge has happened, because the person that's libeling can just say, oh, you were criminally charged. That was my factual basis to say what I said. It's also very tough to sue for things like white supremacist, any label racist. They call an opinion that's very difficult to, again, the only person who they've allowed to sue for their opinions is Alex Jones. And no one else gets, no one should be getting sued for their opinions.
Well,
but that's the nature of it.
And in a case like this, where you're dealing with calling him a murderer versus self-defense is qualification of the act. The act itself is resulting in 2 people getting killed. So whether or not and even if it's murder, it can still be self-defense murder versus.
Yes, exactly. And so almost all it'll be tough to have a clean libel suit. The first objective has to be vindicate the kid. Get him to drop the charges, show them that it's a crazy, bogus prosecution, bring maximum pressure to expose that, because you never want to.
Bring back the police to the street to patrol.
Yes.
Don't force citizens to walk the streets carrying guns to protect businesses from this. It's someone posted something, and I think I responded to it, but it's like, when you embolden the types like the McCloskeys, this is what you get. It's like, no, when you defund the police, you get people like the McCloskeys picking up arms to defend their house. And when you don't have police in the streets, you get people doing things that they shouldn't have to do in a society of law and order. And this stuff, it spirals out of control necessarily. When people have guns and it's dark and it's night and people are throwing, it escalates. The way it doesn't escalate is just to have, some semblance of law and order.
I mean, basically the pitch the media has made is that those business owners were supposed to just sit there and watch their life dream go up in smoke every night.
Yeah.
And because Kyle Rittenhouse was there, the 2 businesses that he was involved in protecting, that didn't happen to. So why are people supposed to let their businesses and their life dreams go up in smoke because the lefties want to weaponize the mob? I mean, this goes back to French Revolution tactics. The French Revolution was the first to really effectively weaponize the mob, and we saw how that turned out.
You weaponize the mob. You de-weaponize the hoi polloi. Who and what do you think is going to happen? It's not a question of blaming or exonerating. What do you think is going to happen? You don't have to be a rocket scientist, sociologist to know that this is the way it goes.
Exactly. I mean, this is John Wayne's America. This is not some wuss version of America. So people are going to defend themselves and protect themselves in time. And I don't blame any of them for doing so. I would prefer nobody to get into a confrontation ever. This is a country that, celebrated, Leonard Skinner, which their favorite thing to do after a concert was to just go to the bar and get into a brawl now and then. So that's the kind of country we live in. So we don't live in a country of people who are afraid to defend themselves and protect themselves. And even though that's what Antifa wants, they want conflict. They want someone they can portray as fascistic in order to procure their revolutionary outcome that they honestly believe will occur, by the way. The ideological types, a lot of the street people are just criminals looking for an political permission slip to act on their psychopathology. But the political types at the top of BLM, there's a lot of good people involved in BLM who are concerned, who've bought into the fake narrative in some cases. In other circumstances, they just have legitimate concerns. I mean, my brother-in-law is involved in a case here in Vegas where he was targeted, clearly, in my view, for racist reasons by racist rogue cops. So they exist. And I've sued a bunch of them. So don't have a problem saying so. But that's not what's happening in many of these cases that they're deliberately choosing for politicized, weaponized purposes. Mm-hmm. But it gets us to the Insurrection Act and whether Trump should time to invoke it.